नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स बुद्धं शरणं गच्छामि धम्मं शरणं गच्छामि संघं शरणं गच्छामि द्वितीयंपि बुद्धं शरणं गच्छामि द्वितीयंपि धम्मं शरणं गच्छामि द्वितीयंपि संघं शरणं गच्छामि तृतीयंपि बुद्धं शरणं गच्छामि तृतीयंपि धम्मं शरणं गच्छामि तृतीयंपि संघं शरणं गच्छामि पाणातिपाता वेरमणि सिक्खापदं समाधियामि अदिन्नदाना वेरमणि सिक्खापदं समाधियामि कामेषु मिच्छाचारा वेरमणि सिक्खापदं समाधियामि मुसावादा वेरमणि सिक्खापदं समाधियामि सुरामेरयमज्जपमादठाणा वेरमणि सिक्खापदं समाधियामि सर्वपापस्य अकरणं कुशलस्य उपसम्पदा सच्चित्तपरियोदपणम् एतं बुद्धान् शासनम् साधु साधु
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So my greetings and best wishes in the Dhamma to everybody here again. I've just been asked to fill in for Thanajan Nyanadhammo, who unfortunately is not feeling so well, and give a talk or say some words on the subject of tudong. Now, tudong is a Thai word which comes from the Pali Dhutanga. And very often these days, or in the modern era, the last 50 or so years, the Thai forest tradition that this Ajahn Chah lineage of ours is part of, is often called the Thudong tradition. And forest monks are often called Thudong monks. And people hear this word for the first time and of course don't really know what it means. Especially I think here in Malaysia, tudong is also the Malay word for the head covering that the Malay women and girls wear. So we're not tudong monks in that sense. So it comes from Dhutanga, so tudong monks or forest monks, Dhutanga monks. And in a sense, the film you've just watched provides a very wonderful visual, and also in terms of the commentary, a very good sense of what some of this lifestyle is about, being a forest monk, being a tudong monk. But as I explain what it means, the original meaning and how it's come to what the modern significance of this lifestyle is, then as well in terms of having a gathering here of the international Ajahn Chah Sangha, we still, in a sense, consider ourselves tudong monks or forest monks, even though we may live in places like New Zealand and the north of England or northern Canada, for example, where, of course, the lifestyle must be very different. So there's another aspect. There's you could say, the spirit of being a tudong monk, or the spirit of tudong, as well as the actual practical conventions. So I'll try and give a bit of an overview first about what this word means, what it comes from. You can see this picture, I can see it on a monitor. There's a monk walking along the road with his bag. So I'll come to that monk in a few minutes. We just have him as a nice image for now. Go back to this word, Dhutanga. So I'll explain a little bit about the original meaning of the word, just to give a flavor. Right from the time of the Lord Buddha, who, as you know, was alive in India roughly 2,500 years ago, in a period where there was a very, very wide diversity of spiritual practice, spiritual undertaking. There was a vast range of ways in which the spiritual life could be led, from the more traditional Brahminical form of priesthood, very much bound up with living in close association with lay people, in fact, as, in a sense, a lay person, with a married and with a family, and much of the focus being on rites and rituals and mantras and chanting, as well as another sphere or another group or way of living out the holy life was the more ascetic, renunciate lifestyle, often called samanas, or ascetics, or wanderers, paribhajjakas. And this is the group that the Buddha decided to join when he left the palace for his search for enlightenment. As we know, he rode out from the palace, according to the somewhat legendary version, shaved off his head, and then undertook ascetic practices. This we do find clearly in the scriptures, undertaking a very intense, severe ascetic practices before finally on the brink of death through mortification practices, fasting, even preventing the in and out breathing, all kinds of incredible austerities which were common in India at the time amongst the whole wide range of different groups and different schools and different practitioners. The Buddha came upon what he then called the middle way. He sustained his body with nice milk rice gruel, got his strength back, and was able to undertake the practice of meditation. And as we all have know and have studied, realized his awakening under the Bodhi tree, and then taught for 45 years. And as the Sangha unfolded and grew, and the whole monastic lifestyle and culture unfolded, then so too did the Sangha also find itself a very diverse group. Even though the Buddha himself seems to have remained more or less a forest dweller, living in forest monasteries outside of the city, and essentially often even going on retreat. Just like you saw, the monks went off for 3 days, the Buddha would go into seclusion as well for 3 days, 7 days, 2 weeks. And many of the monks who we read about were also forest dwellers, yet nevertheless, there were also clearly monks living in the village or city areas. And so even during the Buddha's time, there were two, you could say, groups or two types of ways, generally speaking, that the monastic life could be lived out, devoted more to study and perhaps living in not such a remote area, or the forest monks. And the forest didn't always mean deep in the jungle, like you just saw. A forest monastery or a forest dweller is defined as the distance works out to roughly 1 kilometer away from a village. Which a kilometer is not very far. But remember, in those days, at the edge of a village basically was the forest or the jungle, just like actually in Malaysia not so long ago, at the edge of the kampong is the forest. So if you imagine you're 1 kilometer away from the kampong in a forest, it's quite wild, although you're not very far. And certainly before electricity and before roads, once you got there after your daily alms round, you would be entirely alone for the rest of the day and the rest of the night. So it was definitely have been a very, very secluded lifestyle, just to live 1 or 2 or 3 kilometers away from a village. And those forest areas would certainly have had wild animals, for example. So now to come back to this word, tudong, or Dhutanga. So these forest monks, one of the things that characterized them, or one way of describing them, was that they undertook what are often called the austere practices or the strict practices of Dhutanga, which later give rise to tudong. And so it's an example of how even in the Buddha's dispensation, although we commonly understand that the Buddha had abandoned these very, very strict and very severe self-mortification practices, which were very, very physically painful and physically demanding. Yet nevertheless, the Buddha did allow many, many practices which are also quite challenging. And the word Dhutanga means literally the shaking off. The understanding or the implication is that these practices help us shake off our defilements or our unwholesome, destructive emotions, or essentially our greed, our craving, our negativities, and our ignorance bound up with conceit and the attachment to a sense of self and wanting things our way and not wanting things another way. So undertaking certain practices where we push a little harder, a bit more than the usual monastic code, the Buddha actually allowed these. So just very briefly, what are these Dhutanga practices? The word tudong then comes actually from a certain amount of practices. And the importance or the significance is that it's these practices which are in one sense will define a forest monk and the Ajahn Chah lineage and other forest monasteries in Thailand today, as well as in Sri Lanka and to a certain extent in Burma. So if I can remember them, there are 13 of these practices all in all. And the first two are to do with robes. These are the robes we wear. And the first practice which a monk can voluntarily undertake in order to wear away, to push a little bit against the defilements, is to wear only 3 robes and to only possess 3 robes. So you have one robe, it's called your upper robe. You have one here, which is called your lower robe, and a third robe, which is 2 layers, is called your outer robe. And apart from that, not to have any other pieces of clothing. That's the strictest application of this 3-robe practice. Very, very challenging. So it means that all you have are these 3 pieces of cloth to wrap around your body. When you wash, you have to sort of wash one and then the other and then the other. If it gets dirty, you have to go with it dirty for a while. If it's cold, which it is in India and even in Thailand and north of Thailand, north of Burma, it's very, very cold. So it would mean going without extra blankets, extra hats, extra things like that. Certainly no socks and pullovers and jackets. Now, of course, you perhaps can't do that in the West. But in Asia, it's still possible, although it's very challenging. And so there were monks in those days and still today who undertake this practice. I was talking to one monk recently, and I was just asking him, how do you do it? So he's describing when you wash, how to wash one after another, and how to sleep, maybe even sitting up with your robes just wrapped around you, make a little sort of tent with your robes to keep warm. So it's very challenging, but possible, and it's a way that even these days, some monks, very few, are able to keep close to the Buddha's allowance. Robe cloth would have been hard to come by, and so this practice would have been something which was quite challenging, but also perhaps at sometimes necessary. Another Dhutanga practice to do with robes is the practice of using what we call bangsakula, or corpse cloth, or refuse rags. So basically, these robes were made from sewing many, many pieces together. We have a pattern, and the robes would have been joined by many, many different pieces in the rice paddy pattern. And so rather than accepting bits of cloth which generous lay devotees like yourselves would come and offer to the monks, there was the tradition to go around and one by one gather small pieces from the side of the road or from a waste heap, or to take a piece of cloth, the white cloth that they wrap around a corpse. You would take a corpse or a body to a charnel ground and wrapped in a white cloth, and the monk was allowed to take that cloth because it had been abandoned. It's not stealing. So then to take it, to wash it, and then cut it and sew it, and then dye it with the traditional brown color, and then wear it. So it's a practice where you avoided getting fine robes and have wealthy lay donors giving you nice big robes. As well as if you take up the corpse practice, you have this constant reminder of your own death by being wrapped in a shroud. And again, this is a practice we can still do today in Thailand, where they bring the body to the monastery for cremation, wrapped in a white cloth. And after 1 or 2 days, some of the bodily fluids have oozed out onto the cloth, and these stains will never go away. So you always have a slight patch here and there, and you remember that that's the nature of the dead body. So I'll try and move through them quickly now. There are certain other practices to do with what we call bindabata, or alms round. The practice of only eating food that you gather on alms round itself. So not receiving any food in the monastery. So you go on your alms round and that's all you get. So this morning, all you would have is white rice. So no going to the buffet tables afterwards. Then there's another practice of going to wandering through houses without specifying any particular house, without thinking, I'll go to this house, or I'll go to that house, or I have an appointment, I have an invitation at this house or that house. Just wandering through the village with no fixed route or with nothing in mind. So you might get something, you might not get something. Another practice is to eat only on one occasion. Only you sit down, you have your food, and only at one time. So in most Thai forest monasteries, this is still observed. We eat one meal a day at 8 a.m. or 7:30 or 8:30, but only once. And you can be quite strict with this. So even a small snack or a drink of milk would be considered a meal. So you would make sure you only have one time when you take anything, any solid food or anything like that. Another practice is to do with the bowl. You've seen we have these alms bowls, is to put everything in your alms bowl. So that means not to have little dishes with nice sweets and cakes or soup, or not to use the bowl lid for your fruits, just to have everything in the bowl and it's all in there and you mix it all together. Rice, curries, sweets, fruits, everything. Again, this goes against the stream. Many people just find this, even the thought, disgusting. I remember my mother for years almost couldn't bear to come to visit me in the monastery because she just couldn't bear to see us putting the food all in the bowl. It was just too much. But you do get used to it in time. But it definitely does help, as you say, wear away the defilements or the attachment to nice tastes, nice smells, and having things the way we want. I think the Buddha knew quite clearly we're quite attached to our food. So he's got lots of rules around food and lots of ascetic practices around food. And the last practice to do with food is not accepting late-come food. So once the blessing has been given and you start your meal, if more food arrives, then not to accept it and have extras. The idea being that you basically accept the right amount for that day, and that's all you're having that day. Not to say, oh, now there's some extra goodies, I'll have a bit more. The idea is you have just the right amount and you make a clear determination. When I start my meal, that's good enough. This is what I'm having for the day. Then there are some practices regarding our living environment. So you just saw the video, and some of our branch monasteries there, the monks, they're not living in huts or buildings or kutis. So the first Dhutanga or ascetic practice around living is simply you can live in a hut, but to live in a forest rather than in a city area. That's a tudong or Dhutanga practice. Another practice is to live in what we call a charnel ground or a cemetery or a cremation ground. So you're living in a place where dead bodies come to be either just simply thrown away or dumped there to decompose, or buried or burnt. Now, living in a place like that, I don't know, it may be that some of you are scared of ghosts, and it definitely is something where you do think about these kind of things. It's quite challenging. And of course, one is always with death, so you know other dead people are living here, I'm living here. The feeling comes up very clearly that death is imminent, death is ever present. So this practice wears away, this Dhutanga, shaking off, you shake off your defilements, your attachment to self and life and the idea that we're going to live forever. And just become more and more familiar with death, each in-breath, each out-breath, contemplating death. Then other practices, Abbokasa Wata means to live in the open air. So that literally means to live just with no shelter at all. And this, I think, must have been a very challenging practice, whether in the past or today. I don't know any monks that literally live in the open air, just with no shelter, no roof, no nothing. You can, if you want to be a bit soft, put up a sort of canopy, use your robes to make a little tent to give you some shade, but no hut and not even a tree. Another practice, which is a bit the softer version, is to live at the foot or the root of a tree. So I'll come to that later again and when we look at some pictures. Then the last practice is to do with what we call putting forth effort. And this practice is called Nesajika. Nesajika means not lying down. So the 13th of these Dhutanga or austere practices that we shake off our defilements with is to not lie down for a period of time, usually for one day and one night. So yesterday I talked about walking meditation. It's possible to walk meditation through the night, or sit meditation through the night, or stand through the night. This is a very difficult, challenging thing to do, but in the Ajahn Chah tradition, he did encourage the monks and nuns and lay people as well who come to keep the 8 precepts on the Uposatha to do this through the night, to sit and walk and then chant at 3 a.m. And it really does mean one has to put forth effort. You really find yourself struggling with the constant wish simply to go to sleep or to lie down or to stop. There's this feeling, oh, it's just so difficult, and that's very natural. So one's forced to push oneself, if one can. It's the middle way. So these practices, remember, they're not rules. They're not something that monks have to do. They're called allowances. The Buddha allowed the monks to do that if they wanted to, if their bodies were strong enough, if they had the will or the intention and they wanted to undertake a more austere way of living. So the forest tradition or the forest monks essentially used to take on these practices. But I just want to say now, it's not the case that you can't do these practices, say if you're living in a village monastery or even at home, you can try it. You don't have to sleep tonight if you want. You can walk meditation all night. You can put all your food in a big bowl and mix it all up and eat once a day. So these aren't, you don't have to be a forest monk to do these practices. And monks also in the village and in the cities over the years have also undertaken 1 or 2 of these practices, just as a way of going against the stream. But the reason these Dhutanga practices are associated with the forest tradition is because the majority of the monks undertaking them were living in the forest areas and were what we call the forest monks. So Dhutanga became tudong. The Thai word, the derivation or the way it's pronounced is tudong. So forest monks began to be called tudong monks, which means that they keep these strict practices. Now what happened is, over the years, during this previous century or the last 60, 70, 80 years, as these tudong monks keeping these practices began to walk from one monastery to another, so Ajahn Chah, our teacher, he ordained in the village monastery, and after a few years he realized that the practice and the keeping of the rules wasn't really in line with what he read when he read the scriptures. What did the Buddha really lay down? So he began to seek other teachers. He'd heard about the forest tradition, so he left his village monastery and he heard that there's these other forest masters teaching meditation, they're keeping the rules, they're seeking liberation. But of course, not having any money and there being very few roads, and Thailand being essentially a jungle area, 2/3 of the country or even more covered by forests and jungles, he and the other monks had to walk. There was no choice. It wasn't something which you decided to do, you chose to do, like we go hiking, or these days we go tudong, like you can see in the picture. It's a choice we make. In those days, it was the way to get from A to B, from Ubon town to Korat to Sakonnakhon, Udon. These are towns in Thailand. You had to walk. So what happened is that these monks wandering through the forests, looking very much like this venerable you can see in the picture, keeping these tudong practices, became known as tudong monks. And so people began to get the idea. But this is what tudong means. It means to walk on tudong. It means to walk from A to B through the jungle, and sometimes living in the jungle, and sometimes seeking out a teacher, or just simply going to your home village, or going on to visit another monastery just for a visit, but essentially walking on tudong as opposed to taking a train or a car, and keeping these tudong practices, these 13 practices I've just outlined, living in the jungle, eating once a day, eating out of the bowl. Now you're very familiar with us. Over many years, the forest monks have been coming to Malaysia, so everybody's familiar now. We have our alms bowls and we eat out of our bowls. But many, many years ago, the practice had almost died out, and the forest tradition in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka wasn't so well known. And so monks would still go on alms round using the bowls, but when they got back to the monastery, they would often just be served with plates and bowls and spoon and fork. So this practice became more and more well known again. Oh, there are these forest monks, they eat out of their bowls, they eat only once a day, they live in the forests, in the jungles, and they walk from A to B, partly because we don't use money. That's not a forest, a Dhutanga practice, but it's one of our Vinaya rules. And so not using money often means one has to walk. You don't have somebody to buy you a ticket all the time, a bus ticket or a train ticket or a taxi fare. So if that's the case, then what do? You have to walk. Often you get a lift very quickly. You don't have to go very far sometimes, not much further than the first corner or just to the edge of the village or 100 meters down the road. But nevertheless, you begin by walking. So as time went by, monks began to take on the practice of walking. It became somewhat of a tradition. Now that we are well sponsored and well supported, yet nevertheless we like to sometimes decide voluntarily to go for a walk. Just like in the film you saw, the monks don't have to go off to the jungle in Kanchanaburi there, but they like to do it because it's so nice, it's so peaceful, and to walk for a few days instead of riding in the jeep or riding in the car. So this first picture, maybe just turn to these. There's a few slides which were chosen by Ajahn Nyana Dhammo. If you look at this first picture here, you see the monk there. He's actually carrying one big bag on his right-hand side. Now that, you can see the big bag, and coming out the bottom is this kind of round circular, looks like a little, almost like a frisbee. It's actually the bowl stand that you see we put our bowls on. So the bowl is inside, that bulge, the round bulge in the bag is the alms bowl. The alms bowl is very practical. You use it to eat and to go on alms round, but we also use it as a very convenient suitcase. So we put our robes and our requisites and our bits and pieces in the bowl, close it with the lid, and then put that in the bag. And then we can put other things on top of the bowl. And then what you can see sticking out of the bottom is the bowl stand made of wicker or rattan or bamboo. So that's all this monk has. He's not carrying the long umbrella and mosquito net. And he looks a little bit tired, and it looks like you may well imagine that after a long day, you've been walking all day from A to B, and it often happens that you get to the bottom of the end of the path and you think you might be approaching the monastery, and suddenly you see a sort of long climb. So it looks like there's these long shadows. It looks like it's the evening time, and there's one last climb before getting to the monastery or wherever he's going. And so this is a typical image you can see is on dirt roads. It's much nicer to walk on a dirt road if you can find a dirt road than a normal tarmac road, much less traffic, and you just feel natural. One of the real, you could say, highlights, or the real main point of going on tudong these days, why we would walk from A to B, or to go to a place where we're in the jungle or in a remote area and really walk, is just to be close to nature. And if you have been reading the Ajahn Chah signs, the exhibition, or have read any of his books, or looking at the Ajahn Chah teachings that come up on the screen here throughout the day, so many of them will say, Dhamma is nature, the mind is nature. When you see nature, you see the mind. Understanding nature, you understand the mind. Understanding the nature of the mind. This word, nature, is something which we will have to, as practitioners, keep very close to our hearts. If somebody were to say, what is Dhamma? We could say, Dhamma is nature. And then, of course, that has implications, or you could expand on that. But that's really what it really means. So here, a monk is walking in line with nature, using natural means, left and right foot, simple shoes, no kind of hiking boots or hiking shoes, or just very simple sandals, flip-flop sandals, and carrying everything you need to survive just on one shoulder. So the Buddha talked about the monk being like a bird who travels from A to B, takes only its wings, and leaves no track in the sky. That is the spirit of the Thudong monk. So I'll go to the next slide, see what it is. Okay, very beautiful picture there. In a sense, you've just watched the documentary, which has many of these images on it. Unfortunately, we can't. I asked if you could zoom in on this picture. You can't, so I'll try to describe it. There you can see, this is taken, I think, in one of our national parks. And there the monk is by a beautiful, clear stream. And it looks like it's in the hot season, so the stream it's not very high. It's flowing just nice and slow. It's very clean and clear. You can imagine that the stream would get very high, right up to the trees during the rains. But now it's just very beautiful and like a trickle. And there's a monk there sitting on the edge of the rocks. And behind him, the brown is the mosquito net, just like you saw in the documentary, put up with using the umbrella. Then you can't see really on the picture, but from the right to the left of the screen, there's a line, there's a string. So all of us, we carry a string with us to put up. We use it as a clothesline, as a means of hanging up our mosquito net, and we can use it to fix things, and you can fix your sandals when they break using your string, or you can even climb up a difficult place if you need to using your string. So he's got a string across the river, and then behind where his mosquito net is hanging up, and then it goes all the way behind him. Behind and to the right, you can see two robes hanging up. So that's the robe hanging line. One thing's very important when you're living in the jungle, it's very damp, is you have to keep your robes dry, or at least try to dry them once a day. Otherwise, it's very easy for them to get moldy and mildewy and begin to deteriorate and smelly. So it's very important when you have your place, if you have a nice line, put up your robes every day to give them an airing in the sun, and take them in before the evening, where they'll get damp with the dew. So during the day, you can sit outside like that. There's often not many mosquitoes. It's surprising how in the jungle, there's not often so many mosquitoes during the day. So it's possible to sit outside. There are often other insects, but that can be a practice in itself, sitting and just experiencing what's it like to be bitten here and there. Not so bad. Sometimes little ants coming to investigate you, and just to basically to let go, not worry, because you just can't keep all the ants away, you can't keep the insects away. But after 4, after 5, around 6 p.m., it is really quite difficult to sit out, and there is malaria in jungle areas and in the forest. There was in the time of Ajahn Chah. He had malaria many, many times, as did almost all the monks in those days, and still today when you go and live in the jungle, in the Dtao, the monastery you just saw in the documentary, and this area here, you can get malaria. The best way to prevent that is by making sure you are under your mosquito net tent at dawn and at dusk. Or if you're outside, then to be walking back and forth quickly. So this monk there is practicing what we call dwelling at the root of a tree. So that's one Dhutanga practice. And he's also living in a forest area, so that's 2. He probably eats only once a day, so that's 3. He probably eats only in his bowl, that's 4 of these practices. And if he wants to, he can not lie down for a day and a night. So this is how a tudong monk is also, you have the flexibility, how many or how few of these Dhutanga practices you want to keep. It's obviously not a cemetery, so you can't practice that particular practice there. And he's got his mosquito net umbrella, so he's not living completely in the open. It's got a little bit of shelter. But there's no monastery, so you're definitely living on alms round there. You have to go down and find some village nearby and get your food and come back. So this is how we incorporate these original 13 Dhutanga practices with what we understand by the modern day tudong of more or less going by voluntary choice to wander from one monastery to another, to visit teachers, or to go and live in the forest or a jungle or a national park, just like this. So maybe one day we'll have the tudong, the Malaysian tudong tradition in Taman Negara and these kind of places. Okay, so this slide is taken in one of our hermitages, which is situated in a national park. So this is a good example of how you have a monastery itself, it's a hermitage, situated in a national park. So it's in some ways used regularly. It's a permanent residence for monks. But this is a cave. It's a cave near a stream, near a river. And the monks have been living there on and off over the last 20 years. In the documentary just now, it's the monastery near the Mekong River. And there you can see there's a monk, he's sitting on a little bamboo platform. Again, there's no mosquito net put up. During the day, it's quite okay to sit without a mosquito net. This cave is very low. So if you put your mosquito net up all the time there, it basically hits your head. It's quite awkward. So you just have to put it up when you sleep at night. And so this, you can see there's a wooden frame and it's got bamboo. You can't see there's bamboo slats where he's sitting. And that would last many years. If that cave doesn't get damp and actually get flooded or wet inside, a wooden framed platform with the bamboo slats on top would last easily 5-10 years. But partly it lasts because if you can see, just look at the feet of that platform, you can see what looks like a little dish. And actually each of the feet of that wooden platform or we call it in Thai a tiang, is in a little dish which has got oil inside it. And so no ants or termites can crawl onto the wooden legs. So one, that protects the wood, but that also protects the monk from having creepy crawlies crawl onto him at night. Behind, if you look to say on the picture, if you look to the right, you can just see there's a shrine. So I don't know if I have, oh, sorry. I don't have any kind of pointer. I can't point to it on the slide, but there's a very simple shrine there with a simple black Buddha image. And in the foreground, you'll see there's a big yellow candle. In Thailand, they offer these very big candles. These are very useful because they will burn for many, many days, many, many months even. So you just light one every night for a few hours, and you can get enough light to walk, meditation, back and forth. And it will last many, many days, many months. And really in the foreground, you see this very black kettle. So every monk likes a cup of tea. And so in the afternoon, we all like to boil up a little pot of water. Now, you can see there that the kettle is resting on rocks over a little, like a stove area. One of our rules is that we can't just make a fire on the soil, on the ground. So we have to either make a fire on rock, or it can be made on an old patch of ground where there's been a fire made before. This is one of the rules for Thudong monks, which very much goes back to India, back to the time of the Buddha, when in the Indian culture, the Brahminical culture, the earth was perceived as a kind of life form. And as well as being a life form itself, surely the soil would have housed many, many living beings, small animals. So if a monk were to just light a fire anywhere, it would possibly kill that life form, either the earth with one faculty of life or these animals. Now the Buddha himself didn't seem to have held the view that the earth and stones and water did have a kind of form of life, but nevertheless, that was the Indian belief. So out of respect for that, and so that the monks wouldn't be criticized, we have a rule where we can't just light a fire anywhere. But this is a rock cave, and that place is a rock, so it's actually okay. And it's been lit before by somebody. So that's our blackened kettle. The kettle like that would last many years, but because it's constantly having a fire underneath it, soon the metal breaks down. You see the handles disintegrated, and it's now being held together by wire. And the front part of the handle's leaning forward. It won't be long before that breaks as well. So we like to more or less use them until they disintegrate, because it's always it's a pity to just keep using new kettles for that. So you get about maybe 5 years, 10 years out of a kettle like that, and then request a new one.